Okay, and welcome to part 2 of week 16. We start out talking about fresco. In the increasingly humanistic world of the 14th century, public places and spaces became the preferred settings for many artists' work. As a mural painting method, fresco naturally gained popularity during this time, especially in Italy. The word fresco here is a substitute for the more accurate term buon fresco. Buon fresco is a painting technique that goes back at least to the ancient Roman civilization, if not earlier. Although people have been painting on top of plaster for tens of thousands of years, buon fresco, or true fresco, requires applying a sort of watercolor to wet plaster. When the plaster and paint dry together, the painting bonds to the wall and becomes part of it. Buon fresco is a highly durable mural painting method that responds well to upkeep and cleaning. Many of the most famous artworks of the West are in buon fresco. There are other types of fresco, most notably fresco a secco, or dry fresco. Fresco a secco is painted atop dried plaster, and so it's not as durable as buon fresco. Fresco a secco is usually used to paint details atop buon fresco. Fresco is a highly complicated technique, as you can see on the screen in the technique from your book. Artists who could paint in fresco were in great demand later in the 14th century as focus in painting shifted away from large altarpieces to murals. Mastery of this technique led to large and profitable commissions for many artists. Demand for fresco artists will continue to rise in the Renaissance. Fresco is often considered on its face a humanist art form because of its public nature. Most frescoes reside on large walls and ceilings. However, the content of many frescoes of the 14th century also supports a humanistic perception of the medium. For example, take the fresco known as The Triumph of Death by the artist Buffalmacco. This fresco is found on a wall in the Camposanto cemetery on the grounds of the Pisa Cathedral of Leaning Tower fame. And this is the Camposanto there, so it's on one of the walls inside of the porch. The Triumph of Death is one of the earliest of the surviving frescoes at Camposanto, painted only about 30 years after the structure was built. Triumph of Death depicts a complex set of memento mori, symbols and allegories that are intended to remind the viewer of his or her own mortality, and that he or she should take care of the immortal soul during its brief time on earth. The memento mori was fairly common during the disastrous and deadly wars, famines, and plagues of the Middle Ages. However, the complicated narrative of this memento mori and its emphasis on emotional content definitely puts it in the realm of humanistic art. In one vignette, 3 modern, well-to-do Italians appear to confront their own likenesses in coffins. They recoil in horror at the sight and stench. And in this detail, which is from the lower center of the fresco, demons remove babies, representing the souls of the deceased, from the mouths of corpses that lay in a large pile, including one who appears to still clutch a money bag in death. In Siena, the Italian town in which our large Maestà altarpiece resides, the frescoes known as the Allegories of Government by Ambrogio Lorenzetti demonstrate the town's interests in the welfare of the public and concern with society in general. These frescoes cover the walls of the Sala della Pace, the Room of Peace, in the Palazzo Pubblico, or Public Palace of Siena. The allegories of good government in the city and country display an ideal Siena, where both its urban and farming folk are peaceful and free to create their idyllic society. Giotto, who we met in part 1 of the lecture, was both a panel painter and a fresco artist. Yet his frescoes on the walls and ceilings of the Scrovini Chapel, also called the Arena Chapel for its proximity to a Roman arena, are his best loved works and are considered well ahead of their time. The reason is not so much the subject matter, which is pretty standard for the Middle Ages. Instead, it's his forward-looking, albeit still Gothic, style. Giotto's figures, while still typed in the Gothic fashion, are rounded, 3-dimensional people who exist in architectural space and often exhibit very strong emotions. For example, this lamentation. Not only the facial expressions of the people, but all the writhing and crying of the angels above. To later Renaissance era artists of the 15th century, Giotto was a revelation. In the late Middle Ages, illuminated manuscripts continued to be crafted as important private devotional items. Illuminated manuscripts were still hand-illustrated and lettered books on parchment or vellum made from animal skin, and occasionally paper in the late Middle Ages. These books were valuable and still normally made by people in monasteries or abbeys. The scriptorium, the place where manuscripts were created, was traditionally located inside an abbey in the early Middle Ages, but in the Gothic era, more non-cloistered artists picked up the art form. In the early Middle Ages, a book of Gospels, Psalter, or perhaps a history or science encyclopedia might be the most frequently commissioned. But by the late Middle Ages, Gospels and Psalters gave way in popularity to the Book of Hours. A Book of Hours is typically a very small devotional book made specially for its user. A wealthy individual of the late Middle Ages was likely to have a Book of Hours and keep it on his or her person. The Book of Hours would contain hymns and prayers to be uttered at different times of day and on different feast days. On the screen, you can see an open page of the Book of Hours belonging to Jeanne d'Evreux, Queen of France. As is typical of most richly illuminated manuscripts, decoration does not just include didactic illustration, but also decorative and fanciful imagery, including illumination of capital letters. You can see online examples of Books of Hours in links in the lecture. I just wanted to point out, though, that this book is at the Metropolitan Museum of New York in the Cloisters, and it is tiny. It is absolutely tiny. It's about 4 inches by 3 inches. It's really cool. Another item that was created for Jeanne d'Evreux is the gilt sculpture of the Madonna and Child that resides in the Abbey Church of Saint Denis in Paris, the first Gothic church, if you'll recall. The Abbey Church had long been special to the royalty of France. The Virgin Mary holds a staff topped by a fleur-de-lis, a symbol of French royal family. The Madonna is of a more humanistic late Gothic style. Although the gold and enamel suggests another world, her hip-shot pose and the naturalistic connection between mother and child are both elements of style more closely related to later Renaissance art than medieval art. Other religious items such as vestments, reliquaries, and wooden or iron tabernacles continued to adorn cathedrals and churches throughout the major cities of Europe. In these times, a humanistic flavor was beginning to take hold. The romantic subject matter of the Castle of Love box, for example, which is the subject of The Object Speaks in your book. And this is especially true in Italian art. The late Gothic mood in art of Germany, France, and Prague, on the other hand, was often of mysticism and suffering. This is quite apparent in Vesperbild or Pietà, images of the Virgin Mary. The suffering of Christ after death by crucifixion and the mysteries surrounding his later resurrection are the focus. The mystical quality of Vesperbild Pietas is more appealing outside of Italy. Well, that wraps up week 16 on 14th century Europe, and this is our last unit. Good luck during finals week.